Hello, I'm Thai and a translator. My second language is English and my third is Japanese. If you are familiar with the basic principles of localization, I suggest skipping to the next part. Now, the term localization itself can mean different things for different people. Some would even say that proper translation should already be doing what the word localization entails, viewing it as something akin to a buzzword. Clive Mandolin, a seasoned Japanese to English translator who's long been offering a window into subjects surrounding localization via his website and books, stated in his latest physical publication that localization is preserving the creator's intended meaning but with completely different words. But even then, I'm not too confident where the line between localization and translation is drawn. For example, Neko no te mo karitai is an expression trying to convey that the speaker or their group is so busy they even seek help from a cat. I feel like I'm willing to say that "so busy I've asked a cat for help" is a translation because it keeps the details intact, while "I'm extremely swamped" is a localization as it considers how English has no such expressions, and keeping said details would make the speaker sound like they were exaggerating. You may have already seen the flaws in my reasoning. The first one took the liberty to add "so busy," so one can argue that it's localized. The second one is indeed localized, but justifying that keeping the cat aspect would have made it sound more exaggerated is debatable, as the source text did choose to use the expression instead of a more direct statement, so one could say that the source intended to exaggerate. I hope this exercise shows how I am not claiming to know some sort of definite line between localization and translation, nor advocate for the abolishment of localization, nor am I under the assumption that there's only one correct way to localize. With that said, I have problems with how Japanese to English localization, especially for games, often deviate from the source. Now, since I'm neither a native Japanese nor native English speaker, I want to try presenting the qualms I have as questions. Number 1. Why change it? This question is one I can attempt to answer by myself. Aside from cases that are obvious or can be found on Clyde's website, one particularly interesting reason behind heavily transformative localization is emotional experience, as described by Janice Zhu. While one can argue that emotional experience is heavily subjective, it's always worth considering whether your translation has elements that get in the way of the more important ones. This, of course, can venture into censorship territory when, as brought up in the same entry, a throwaway joke could potentially be too over the line in target language. I won't discuss censorship here as that's a whole nother contentious subject, and I get why people take the "give them an inch and they'll take a mile" stance, but I do want to say that the creators are also generally not actively trying to offend people is supposed to be a valid and responsible reasoning. The phrase "being abused to hell and back" sure doesn't help its case, not to mention the subjectivity of what's over the line, but as a translator I can confidently say I would never ever be in a situation where I have to make this kind of edit. Ideally, the creator should be informed of the concern with cultural context and get to decide whether the text is important enough to stay. But such opportunities are very rare, and there's a point where a decision must be made with the reception toward the entire work at stake. There's also the fact that translation is part of a business trying to make a profit, which can bring in supervisory intervention or, alternatively, poor quality control. In a way, stuff being changed in localization is like a restaurant offering foreign cuisine while also adjusting recipes according to local tastes. Preferences can always shift, of course, and I think that, even without any controversy, the demographic of people wanting the original flavor would still naturally increase over time. Now let's move on to question number 2 before I digress any further. Why ignore the source? So changes can be chalked up to censorship, added humor, punching up, or some kind of stylistic choice. And while those are also worth being scrutinized, there are stuff like these two scenes from Fate EXTELLA. In the original, Tamamo was clearly playing up her villainous side, declaring that the digital world here is bound to be destroyed under her rule, alluding to the legends of her bringing ruins to an entire empire and its people, even went as far as to say that it's her very nature to do so. The English version purged all the negative aspects and portrayed Tamamo as a rival faction leader vying for unification. This kind of difference in characterization is arguably the most serious among all the end results that come from ignoring the source, and I just can't grasp the reason behind it. In this particular game, they did keep this line referencing Japanese poetry intact, so the odds of them being unfamiliar to the darker tales of Tamamo should be pretty low. So why? For this kind of change, the only explanation I could ever come up with is that the translator, or the localization team as a whole, had different plan on what or when the character would say something. And I'll admit that there may be some godly localizers that can scramble everything up and still dish out end products that preserve the creator's intended meaning but with completely different words. But what about the emotional experience? Even if we would measure emotional experience from a more zoomed out perspective, how would meeting the Tamamo who didn't act like the personification of her evil aspects in your first re-encounter be considered emotionally accurate to re-encountering the Tamamo that did? What is being considered a minor detail and what isn't? Earlier in the same cutscene, Tamamo hurled a serious accusation at Nero, who then proceeded to deny it in an obvious way that the crime was indeed committed. Now in the original, Tamamo also specified that being choked by Nero sent her to the far side of the moon, a significant location in Fate Extra CCC. That sounds important, but okay. The fact that CCC was never localized could be used as the reason to omit this detail. I would vote against it, but at least there would be a clear principle as to why the detail was deemed minor and ignored. Then, a few instances later, Nero decided to cut to the chase and asked what Tamamo was trying to accomplish. Punching up or stylizing aside, this ignores how, in the original, Nero offhandedly admitted that she's not that all better than Tamamo in terms of resorting to drastic means. This one I can totally see how some would consider this a minor detail, but I really want to point out that this detail reflects the character's personality and also doesn't seem to warrant any omission. One franchise very dear to me is Kingdom Hearts, and at a glance, it seems to be at the right spot in terms of emotional experience and fulfilling the goals of good localization. But as a fan who's still in the process of actually delving into it, there are actually many things worth discussing. Stuff being so heavily transformed it created inconsistency in sequels is among the major criticism toward localization. I will admit that it's unfair to demand that translators have future vision on what would end up being important in the sequels. But at the same time, it's also fair to point out that there, most likely, wouldn't have been any issue if the localization playbook wasn't so enthusiastic about paraphrasing. Since I'm still far from having enough data for that angle, let me instead present to you this scene from Kingdom Hearts 3. This franchise is often bashed for its snobbishly convoluted plot, and in these scenes here, it turns out that the English version is written like it's foreshadowing something very specific. While in the original, it can still foreshadow future events, but it reads more like a lesson for Sora to consider the downsides of hearts being connected, something he has only viewed in a positive light, prompting him to feel anxious about hurting people he holds dear. It also sounds like it doubles as a meta message about how selfless actions can negatively affect those who care about us. But that might just be me putting this franchise on a pedestal. Admittedly, Square Enix games may not be the best for this kind of analysis, especially the more modern ones, as the English version might be gradually written alongside the Japanese script, or the English team may have a lot more autonomy than what one would expect translators to have. Kingdom Hearts games, specifically, seem quite likely to be developed that way, as the personalities of Disney characters appears to be based on their respective version. Regardless of how things work behind the scenes, however, my third question still stands. Is the process really optimal? There are several meanings behind this question, but the most important one is that I am dying to know how acceptable the prevailing localization playbook really is by localization's own standards, with how its methodology seems to prioritize other aspects to such a degree that faithfulness has to suffer. When the demo for Unicorn Overlord was released, a Twitter thread was made by Sakogdo regarding the differences. While it is not flawless, as Sakogdo admitted after getting valid feedback, the main argument regarding changes in characterization is true. Furthermore, on the YouTube channel Japan Day Tripper, Michael, along with his brother Dan and with extra help from his Japanese friend, have made a breakdown on the demo, in which, even if one were to consider most of the changes insignificant, there was still a clear case of mistranslation. Kajitani Eisan, who had previously touched on the good and bad of localization for some entries in the Tales of series, also pointed out the errors in system text. Most notably is this example, which is very similar to the test used to gauge how much a translator understands system texts that have codes in them, or have variables controlled by such strings. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, is really the way to go, but it's somehow seemingly not favored by the current playbook. Now I understand that at certain point things will come down to a matter of preference. But since the end results are contradictory to what localization promises to achieve, perhaps it's time to re-evaluate the process? Maybe more time should be spent on catching mistranslations instead of adding witty writings? Focusing efforts and talents more on how to faithfully represent the source and less on how to create unique identity for the English version? If what's been happening behind the scenes was not a case of disproportional resource allocation, but rather a case of insufficient resource, question number 3 would also be directed at those above the localization process as well. Are translators being treated fairly? Are those managing them help facilitate qualities I've seen being championed? I was among the people translating Cyberpunk 2077 into Thai. A big chunk of my work was text belonging to a dossier of some sort. They came in a wide variety: official statement, personal communication, scientific report, advertisement, novel, propaganda piece, cooking instruction, you name it. And on top of that were notes indicating that those were written by at least 3 different writers. I was supposed to faithfully replicate their 20,000 word effort within a week or so. Subtitling jobs I used to take were also the most hopeless of all media in terms of endorsing faithfulness. Now I do expect that the process of English localization for big titles would be handled better than niches like Thai. But if that isn't the case, we clearly need more whistleblowing than whatever we are doing to each other right now. I was baffled when a person who has a doctorate relevant to Japanese language dismissed the Unicorn Overlord thread and claimed that this line from both versions have the same level of aggression. The only reasoning I could come up with was that they measured it with the sociology of the present in real-life Japan. So a kid like Elaine addressing Joseph with omae is outrageous. Plus him asking for a favor with a straight kure is like one step away from an order, which I guess could be seen as aggressive considering the age gap and the general layers of politeness Elaine's not supposed to ignore. But that's still a bad take since it ignores how a prince like Elaine had the authority to outright command Joseph, yet he still chose to word it as a request. They've also criticized that rendering Boku no Koto wa Ii as "I'll be fine" was an amateurish mistake, something I'm strongly displeased with, as it is absolutely within the scope allowed by localization to reflect Elaine putting his mother before him with "I'll be fine." Yes, the English voice actor said the line in a way that portrays Elaine as troubled and confused by the crisis, so the line actually isn't purely accusatory. No, that fact doesn't excuse the change, because in the original, Elaine was calm and mature despite his young age, something Michael noted right in the beginning of his video using Elaine's very first line. Another case of needless antagonization involves the change to the final dialogue in FF7 Remake. Some appear to take it as a taste of what would happen if the dissenters got their way, but honestly, that's missing the root of the problem. If the English team had rendered the line more faithfully, expressing Aerith's direct feeling towards the open sky and not paraphrasing it into a longing for the past environment, you could have had an accurate dialogue with the same flair you love. Would there be absolutely no complaints if that were the case? Well, there likely would still be complaints since the line would still be spiced up, but at least there would be no need to patch away the version you like. Personally, I feel both the old and new line sound oddly like she's expressing it to a listener instead of simply muttering to herself. You know, certain aspects of the discourse kind of resemble the eternal question of what makes a good adaptation, like when is it okay to get creative, when is it out of line? Think of the original author and everything. One might say that localization should not be handled like adaptation, and that opinion would align with what Clyde Madeline says in his latest book. However, it should be noted that Clyde had also praised some of Ted Woolsey's changes before, while also pulled no punches when he felt that said version missed the point. So, added jokes are out of line because they are intrusive, but other modifications are allowed for their potentials to enrich the content, similar to how some view adaptations? Or had Clyde simply gained new perspectives from being part of the Undertale Japanese localization? Aside from the usual points against adding or removing things, I would like to advocate that a minor detail to someone can be very important to another. Again, I'm not sure how good Kingdom Hearts is as an example, but let's look at the scenes where Sora, meeting with Hades, gave us a glimpse on his normal life by saying that even Sora's uncle had a bigger reaction seeing his face again, suggesting that he's been reuniting with relatives during his return to Destiny Islands. This line in English simply led up to a Hades-appropriate Heat-related joke. While one can argue that the original is also just a common Japanese joke of grown men hating being seen as an old fart, I think it's not a stretch to say that the original attempted to make the joke while also adding tidbits that fans would appreciate. Additionally, what was stopping the English version from adding said detail? Sora could instead say something like, "Just us? You're even colder than my uncle," and Hades could still respond being his signature self just fine. Now that could potentially be portraying the uncle in a harsher light, but at least Sora's personal life would still make it through. In conclusion, I hope this observation from a third party's perspective will contribute toward understanding and solution. If it weren't for question number 2 and 3, I might have been able to just accept all the differences as something the English-speaking market demands. But it's really hard to do so when prominent products of localization contradict the basic principles while being hailed as examples of good localization. Many would say that the discourse is a proxy of culture war, to which I admit that it would be dishonest to say that it is free of such influences. But I believe the questions I'm asking are things that manifested naturally from a heart of a translator, from a heart of a fan whose impression toward a character might have once been negatively affected by the changes made in the English version. Ideally, it would be nice if there were some sort of database hosting screenshots of all text in any given work with individual notes comparing the translated version to the original. But there are many reasons why that's not feasible. So, I guess those who can gotta do what they can. I took so long getting this done that, right now, Michael has already done breaking down the localization of Valkyria Chronicles 1 and is now going through Valkyria Chronicles 4. His brother Dan has also been playing Final Fantasy XIV in Japanese as an attempt to show how things were changed by the localization. And it took so long, Michael had already finished VC4 and is now gearing up to analyze Metaphor Refantasio together with Dan. I originally wanted to make something much more comprehensive and spectacular on this subject, but that seems especially far-fetched now after I've tried to get this video done. Regardless, thank you for listening. If there's anything you feel I should have talked about, please let me know. Actually, there's another example I couldn't fit in because it's already too long. If you'd humor me, I would like to present to you what may be the oldest and most influential misrepresentation brought about by localization. The 3 Wise Monkeys.